Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the next session of the EU UK Forum. I'm Peter Foster. I'm the Public Policy Editor at the Financial Times and spend quite a lot of my time grappling about over how, as we emerge into two separate systems, the EU and UK economies are going to mesh. Now, to help us navigate this, I've got two brilliant people. Professor Anu Bradford at Columbia Law School, who literally wrote the book on Brussels regulation, on the Brussels effect, is the author of that book, and I think responsible for the coinage originally as well. And also Sam Lowe from the Centre of European Reform, who has become, I think, for people like me anyway, a doyen of not just trade Twitter, but also level-headed, perspicacious, insightful and calm analysis of where we're going to go now we've entered the post-Brexit world. If you haven't read his paper that just came out on the EU carbon border adjustment tax and how the UK is going to mesh with that, I thoroughly recommend it. We are on the beginning of a journey here. The nature of the Brexit that was done was, as we know, very sovereignty focused. The faction of British politics that won the Brexit argument have always militated not only against Brussels red tape, but also the sense of a Brussels that is prescriptive and legalistic. It likes this, what it calls its common law approach to less of the precautionary principle, something broader, something that it believes will be nimbler and more dynamic. Now, over the years, we've had endless reviews. The Balance of Competences Review 2012 to 2014. There was a big Bayes review, the Business Department in the UK afterwards, also trying to look for where regulatory divergence in the UK could pay dividends. It's why we didn't follow EU state aid policy. We now have our new subsidy control policies, which we'll talk about. It's why we're creating our own system of UK CA marks to go alongside and possibly diverge from the EU CE mark. It's why we've just heard announcements on how, given that we're not going to have an equivalence mechanism anytime soon or equivalence finding for financial services, the British government already looking at ways in which the city can regulate itself differently. Ian Duncan Smith, a very talismanic Brexit politician in the UK, setting out in his TIGR report. I would call it TIGR report. It's actually the Task Force on Innovation, Growth and Regulatory Reform. Again, looking at how Britain can benefit from divergence. But it's doing so with this enormous economy, 465 million people on its doorstep, that takes 47% of its exports in 2019 or 43%, that has this undeniable Brussels effect. So, Anu, as the author of that book, when you look at that landscape, which is only now just forming, how do you see the UK's desire for independence? How do you see that working against just the gravitational force of the European Union?
So, Peter, I am not at all surprised that there is this desire to assert regulatory sovereignty. It was an absolutely central promise of the Brexit campaign, and the government needs to show that this whole ordeal was worth it. So there's certainly a political pressure to enact some regulation that does not track what is happening in Brussels. There's a separate question, though, whether the businesses actually will follow that, whether they take advantage and feel that they are bound only by the regulations coming from their own government. Because it's inevitable that you also need to continue to obey by the regulations that are enacted by your closest trade partner. So almost 50% of the UK trade is destined to the European Union. The EU is the #1 trading destination for the key UK industries, whether we talk about automobiles or whether we talk about chemicals, pharmaceuticals, financial services, aerospace. So these companies will continue to obey the EU rules if they want to continue to have market access to the EU. So the choice they face then is whether they, for instance, start setting up a second production line to produce different standard for products that they sell domestically. So if you are a UK manufacturer of automobiles and you have a market that is 6 times the size of your domestic market, you are not going to ignore the standards that come from Brussels. And it is not in your economic interest to set up that second production line and start producing 2 variations. So this is at the core of the concept of the Brussels effect, the idea that the EU law has the effect outside of the borders because the companies like uniformity. They don't like the cost of complying with multiple regulatory regimes. And they have the tendency to follow the larger markets and the more stringent standards that give them access to multiple different markets as well.
And just a quick follow-up there. So if you take something like medical devices, which I've been looking at this week, the UK market is 4% of global market for medical devices. The US market is 43%, the EU market 22%, the Chinese 29%. And then we'll come to Sam on this as well. But what's to say that actually as the UK starts to regulate post-Brexit, it doesn't actually regulate more towards the FDA, even if it's not going to have its own UK standard, regulate more towards the FDA, regulate more towards the rest of the world? Does it have to be the Brussels effect? There are other competing regulatory systems out there.
Absolutely. We haven't seen a lot of desire by the Americans to regulate. So there's not a very strong Washington effect. The other thing we haven't really seen is the willingness of the US to embrace free trade and strike these trade agreements. So I'm not holding my breath as to when the US-UK trade agreement will be enforced and how easy that path to a negotiation will be there. But I think you're absolutely right, Peter, that there may be certain industries within which there's enough demand in some foreign markets and where the UK would then benefit from producing towards those standards. But in trade, fundamentally, geography is what matters. There is no easy way to abandon the market that is, using your words, right at your footsteps, 450 million wealthy consumers, and divert that trade to places where the transportation costs and various other trade barriers are still in presence. So the UK is trying to strike these other trade deals, and it is very wise for it to do so. But it is very difficult to replicate the depth of the trade agreement that it had with the EU. So even if you don't have the tariffs then, vis-a-vis another third country that you start trading with, there are a bunch of regulatory barriers that take a long time to dismantle and open the trade for the UK producers.
Right. I mean, Sam, you've always been very good at mapping the gap between the politics and the reality. And we know that the political narrative is about sovereignty. Lord Frost sometimes says, I don't really believe so much in gravity. I don't really believe in non-tariff barriers. I don't really, he said to a select committee the other day, a UK parliamentary committee, that, while it's not just China, the US and Europe who set standards, the UK can have its own role. So where in the real world, and I know it's early days, where do you see divergence and where do you see continued convergence?
So this is the big question, really, and of course, as you've mentioned in your intro, it's something that the British government is quite keen to find an answer to as well, as in it hasn't fully articulated this vision to itself. But I think as a starting point, we need to take into account that while the free trade agreement itself was a sovereignty first type deal in that it put up some quite significant barriers to trade between the EU and the UK because the UK wanted flexibility to regulate itself for Great Britain, Northern Ireland is of course in a slightly different orbit. Yeah. In terms of the actual regulatory practice of the UK right now, it is pretty much the same as the EU's, or it is the same as the UK's regulatory practice was whilst it was an EU member, because we've only just left and we've inherited a whole load of rules. So this question of how this relationship evolves over time is quite fascinating. And I think, if we start with convergence or reconvergence, I think we can say that there are 2 different types. There's formal and informal convergence. And at the moment, in terms of the political narrative, there's quite a lot of resistance to formal convergence. Every time someone mentions, we should do an EU-UK Swiss-style veterinary agreement to alleviate some of the trouble for food exporters sending goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but also Great Britain and the rest of the European Union, the British government says absolutely not. They're very much opposed to this kind of formal convergence. But in terms of informal convergence, the UK is still copying the EU's approach in many, many areas. You've mentioned product standards, for example. So until the end of the year, the UK, and it will probably, I think, extend this period, is still recognising EU CE marking for products placed on the UK market. And for medical devices, that's extended till 2023 already. And even when the UK introduces its own UK CE mark, the UK product standards body has just announced it's managed to remain party to the European Standards Organization, so CEN-CENELEC, which is largely driven by the EU agenda. So even though we're going to have a different label on these products, for the most part, they will still be European standards. They will completely match EU standards. And this is a sort of informal convergence that no one really articulates, but is going to continue. There's not going to be hardly any divergence at all on product standards, even if we put a different label on it. And then on the divergence side, I think you then have to differentiate, and I put this into 3 categories rather than 2. So deliberate, de facto, and performative. So if we start with deliberate, this is where the UK takes a conscious decision to diverge, sometimes for potentially a very good reason. So one example of this that has already happened, or is about to happen, is the Bank of England has announced it wants to diverge from EU rules which allow investment in software to be counted towards a bank's loss-absorbing capital. So this is actually a tightening of rules. This is going to be stricter than the EU approach, because they don't think investment in software is very useful loss-absorbing capital. They think if everything goes wrong at a bank, that's not actually going to help anyone, right? So they think that that risk should be taken into account. So that's some deliberate divergence, if only small. But then you also get de facto divergence. And this is where the EU introduces a rule and the UK perhaps doesn't follow. And we've already seen an example of this in that the EU introduced a new animal health regulation on the 21st of April, and this hasn't been implemented in Great Britain. But then we go back to informal convergence, because despite the fact the UK hasn't implemented this, it's actually had to legislate to adapt to this rule because it wants to be able to continue selling products into the EU market. And then just to conclude, when you think of the drivers of these of convergence, so if we start with convergence, the drivers of convergence, we've got regulatory gravity, we've got proximity, we've got the Brussels effect, which we've discussed. We're also going to have business pressure that will push for some more convergence. If we think about mobility issues, we're already hearing musicians, for example, making quite a lot of loud noise over that. And yes, the British government doesn't want to do anything about that now, but it's sort of inconceivable to me that in 10, 15 years, we don't have some sort of preferential mobility arrangement with the countries right next door to us. You also have the Trade and Cooperation Agreement itself, which drives convergence in some areas, because there are penalties for divergence if you diverge in a way that impacts on trade and competition in areas such as subsidies, labour and the environment. And then you've also got Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland drives convergence in a sense that if the UK or Great Britain diverges too much, it actually exacerbates the issues around the internal border within the UK. But then in terms of drivers of divergence, and this is where I'll finish, you have differing regulatory future priorities. So on future regulations around financial services, digital data, stuff that Anu can cover very well, the UK might just have a different vision of where it wants to go to the EU. You then also have trade ambition. So the UK's trade agenda has already signaled some divergence from EU approaches in terms of we're actually happy to liberalise agriculture, it turns out. And you could also point to CAP reform as a regulatory measure that signals divergence from EU approaches. And then just to sort of finish on my final point, you also then have the performative element. And this is the most sort of dispiriting element of all of this, where the UK might just announce it's going to scrap something just to say it did it. And this is obviously the least useful form of anything, because there's no other reason to do it other than to play to the base. So it might just be talk. I'm sure we'll re-announce scrapping the working time directive every 6 months or so, right? It's that sort of thing. It never happens, but we'll announce it anyway. And it's that sort of performance politics.
There's loads to unpack there, Sam. I mean, I've a few observations. One is, you're right. There's pressure from industry. There has been all the way along. It's been absolutely fruitless. The performative aspect is incredibly important. So actually, where musicians and others have pushed for some kind of mobility chapter that the UK rejected because of sovereignty issues and immigration control issues at the time of the negotiation, and therefore there will be quite a lag, as you talk about, 10 to 15 years, but quite a lot of supply chain, outbound travel, jobs in chalets and whatever. A lot of companies will rebuild supply chains and structures, which is part of the plan. So it seems to me that's not going to happen immediately. The other question I have for you is, you talk about de facto convergence. So this week I was talking to a UK maker of weather products. They make systems that go on oil rigs and airfields and wind turbines, etc. And they import components from Germany and Sweden, etc., in their anemometers, their wind measures, and their celiometers that measure, I learned this week, the height of clouds. And they're trying to get their suppliers to sign up to UK CA marks, which, as you say, at the moment are cut and paste. Now, my question to you is, this company was saying, okay, we're convincing our EU suppliers to cut and paste at the moment. It's probably just about worth it. What we're worried about is either the UK does diverge, or the UK fails to actively remain converged. So my question to you is, if the UK doesn't continue to not just say, well, it comes down to the same thing, but actively make sure that UKCA mirrors precisely the EU standard, so it continues to be cut and paste, then you're going to have de facto divergence, and then you're going to have companies, to Anu's point, testing to two regimes, and then you're going to have EU companies that can't be bothered or don't see the commercial upside in bothering to register. Now, those are strong forces, but they are real, aren't they?
Yeah, of course. So you're, of course, going to have some of that at the margins, but we should work on the assumption that most of the UK's standards as applied within the country will be based on European and international standards going forward, as was the case within the European Union. And of course, there are some national standards that still exist for areas that haven't been addressed at either European or international level, where you can get some of that divergence. And of course, there is the fear that the government itself will regulate in certain areas that will then require divergence on standards. But to get to sort of break down your point a bit further, the issue with de facto alignment is you don't get all the benefits from it. So even in the areas where the UK de facto remains aligned on product standards, by which I mean the actual requirements are the same.
Yeah.
Because the UK is going to require a new label, that's something different that the businesses have to do. You have to incorporate that onto the packaging or the product somewhere. But also there's a liability issue now, because whereas before a UK importer buying something from the EU could just be assured that that product, when it was created in the EU, was placed on the market by the supplier, now the UK importer has to take on board that liability. It needs a copy of the Declaration of Conformity, and it needs to take legal liability for placing it on the UK's market, and the reverse is also true. So de facto alignment has some benefit for businesses on the production side, but it's not the same as sort of deliberate convergence and alignment and regulatory harmonization, which actually removes a lot of these requirements.
No, and in fact, this weather company, systems company, was in fact in the process of drawing up legal agreements so that when they placed CE marked products onto the UK market, they were able to indemnify themselves or make sure that even though they carried the legal responsibility, they were covered with their EU suppliers, and vice versa. So UKCA marked products that have been placed on the market by an EU business, the legal liability is with the EU place on the market. So
it's fun, isn't it?
Mental, but there we are. I see the first question coming in. Please keep the questions. They're being curated down, I think, the right-hand side of your screens for chat box. Fire in some questions, and we're going to get to those pretty quickly. And before we do that, Sam and I talking there about existing products, the nitty-gritty of UKCA and CE markings mirroring each other, whether they do or don't. But very often, and you look at the May government, and you look at some of the rhetoric from the Brexiteers who are struggling to kind of sell the upsides of two regulatory systems, they will go, but the thing is not really about things that are made now. It's all about the future. It's all about digital startups and AI and blockchain and all the stuff that's coming down the tracks. Now, in that space, do you see a world for the industries of the future, the industries that are not yet born, that post-Brexit Britain has an advantage, is going to have a place, as the Israel on Thames, or how do you see us fitting in there?
So, Peter, I actually think that there can be some upside. The UK being smaller can be more nimble. It could be a laboratory for many of these regulations. And if you think about how the EU regulation generally comes about, it is rarely invented in Brussels. It has been first tested in individual member states. So the GDPR, the privacy regulation, didn't emanate from Berlaymont in Brussels. It came from Germany and France and Sweden. The ETS, the emissions trading scheme, was premised on what the UK was doing, what Denmark was doing. So I think there's absolutely some advantages in going out there first. But in the past, when the UK invented something and was being nimble and was being proactive, it had the chance to leverage those regulations by then incorporating that into an EU standard and then via the Brussels effect to a world standard. So now the UK cannot take it for granted that the EU would always follow what the UK does. And then again, we come down to a very fundamental question of the size of your market. Even if the UK is very inventive, if the market next to you with so much more heft comes with an alternative standard, the gravitational pull is there. And I doubt that the EU remains inactive when it comes to new domains. So you mentioned the AI. The EU is already there. It has already proposed the most advanced or elaborate regulatory proposal on artificial intelligence. Given its priorities in digital and in environmental protection, climate change, the EU is likely to be continuing to occupy that space as opposed to taking the step back. So in that sense, I think there can be some foresightful regulation. What I do hope that we at least see a lot of cooperation, like we now see in some domains of digital, when the EU and the UK are actually pursuing very similar paths in reining in big technology companies, that we would see the two continue their regulatory dialogue and come up with the regulations that are both nimble and efficient.
Sam, we thought you popped off for a tea break, but here you are, back with us.
I was furious. I signed out now, Jake.
So, Anu was talking about market size, and you've talked about performative divergence, but also, interestingly, you talked in your paper, and we've seen it with food standards, vet standards, Northern Ireland, and the UK government's real resistance to a Swiss-style or a high alignment veterinary agreement that would solve so many of those border issues. And similarly, there's an ideological resistance to aligning or getting an exemption on the carbon border tax, like the Swiss have. Even though it would make actual sense both for the Northern Irish Protocol, but also for the UK market more generally. Do you see a lot of spaces where it would make sense, if you're from the industry lobby, it would make sense for the UK to align, where they simply won't, because politically the need for performative divergence is so strong? And this is a real crystal ball question, but how long do you think that's going to last?
I mean, well, it's fairly easy to identify areas in which industry would like greater convergence, right? Particularly in the context of them having to deal with all of these barriers quite suddenly at the beginning of this year, and a desire to just go back to the good old days. And I suppose the UK argument would be, well, there was always going to be an adjustment phase, and businesses will adapt to the new normal, and then they perhaps might be more grateful for some of the decisions we've taken. But at this moment in time, not so much. But the emissions trading system is an interesting one, in that the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement left open the possibility of the UK linking up its own scheme, which has come into effect recently, with the EU's. But we haven't had much more news on that. That was meant to have been decided in the first half of the year. It doesn't seem to have been decided. And I suppose the point I was making recently, this week in my paper, is that when it comes to the EU's new proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism, it appears, going off the leaked draft, that the only way for a third country to get an exemption is to either be covered by the EU's emissions trading system, so Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, or to have linked their own emissions trading system up to the EU, so Switzerland. And in the absence of an exemption, even though your exports might not be penalised because they have paid a domestic carbon price at home, which would be the case for exports from the UK, importers in the EU buying from the UK, so buying steel, aluminium, fertiliser, cement or the like, will have to go through this new administrative process, which is going to be quite bureaucratic and come with an additional cost.
Even though, certainly trading, the ETS, the EU and the UK carbon prices are pretty aguile, no?
Yeah. So in the absence of a full exemption, despite the fact that, yes, as you say, the prices will be similar, the UK is actually quite good on climate change. It has its own pricing system. We'll assume the price will be high. Importers in the EU, probably higher. And importers in the EU from the UK will still have to go through a new process. And as we've discovered through Brexit, actually, a lot of the cost base is to do with processes. It's to do with administrative procedures. It's to do with form filling, and the like. So the UK has a decision here to make, and it still has to decide whether to link its emissions trading system to the EU's. But there's now a greater incentive to do so, because doing so could see the UK fully exempt from the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. And then there's also a Northern Ireland dimension to this, which I don't think we have to get into now, but it gets even more complicated.
Let's not do that, but suffice to say it would make life easier for the Northern Ireland Protocol. Okay,
absolutely.
So we have a question here from Malcolm Harbour, which I think is going to take us into a direction I know that we wanted to go when we were discussing before we joined the panel, to take a more global look, because I used to be based in China in 2009 to 12, and I remember when I arrived there just after the Olympics, there was still a kind of sense of, before they kicked Google out, that the direction was convergence. But it's pretty clear now that there's now another rival and often sort of quite sealed ecosystem. So global Britain is setting sail into much choppier trade waters than even, I think, when it was sort of first envisaged back in 2015. And the question from Malcolm Harbour is that new UK inventions will not achieve global success without agreement to global standards. How is the UK placed to influence new standards against the voting power of the EU and US? And I'm going to add China there, because I think they're going to become an increasing player as we go forward. Anu, that's one for you, I think, initially.
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely true that this realizing this promise of a global Britain is very difficult today. The world has taken a turn towards protectionism, which doesn't seem to be waning even when President Trump is gone. We have very entrenched protectionist pressures in many parts of the world, including in the United States. So President Biden is no committed free trader. He doesn't have that mandate from his own Democratic Party that is quite divided on the issue whether free trade is good. And the Republican Party remains still under the stronghold of President Trump, and there's a lot of America first kind of thinking. So if there's one thing that American fractions agree on, is this threat of China. So that, again, pushes America towards much more sovereigntist position, but it looks for allies elsewhere. So there are certain areas where I think the alliances can be built. And one area is this divide that is now emerging between authoritarian state and democratic states. And there I've been happy to see the UK's voice, for instance, calling for cooperation among techno-democracies, where the UK and the EU and the US have a much greater common interest to rein in the spread of the digital authoritarian surveillance technologies that China is producing and exporting. So I think that would be an example where we would try to all recognize the common challenges in the global order and see that we are actually partners in trade, partners in values, partners in the way we believe the world should be governed, and try to put aside some of those differences in the interest of addressing issues ranging from climate change to the authoritarian threats.
Yeah, I mean, Sam, we've always, it seems to me, we've yo-yoed recently on China. Go back to the Osborne Cameron, era. I think we've always been on the more dovish side. Do you see the emergence of a more strategic UK-China policy vis-a-vis trade, or are we still yo-yoing about? One of my observations about China is partly that the politics in China doesn't always equate into the trade sphere. So when David Cameron saw the Dalai Lama, UK diplomats were frozen out of all meetings for about 14, 15 months, and the volume of UK-China trade went up. Right, so there's always a lot of noise around the politics of China, and I just wondered, given we want to join the CPTPP, sorry, I never get that right, but what used to be the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, which China was obviously excluded from. Do you see, that as part of a kind of bigger strategy, and is it the right strategy?
I think, as you say, I'm always quite unsure what the UK's approach at any given time is to China. And just to give a bit of recent history on this, the UK has yo-yoed quite significantly just in the last couple of years, insofar as, and this can be pulled into the China debate, but for a while the UK was very much prioritising the domestic agenda over the trade agenda. This has now shifted slightly, and by that I mean it was prioritising the rollout of 5G within the UK over the immediacy of a potential UK-US trade agreement under Donald Trump. And the reason that was made more difficult was actually Huawei was a big part of the discussion when it came to the 5G rollout. And the UK was quite hesitant to restrict Huawei from being used in its telecommunication systems because it would slow down what was viewed as a big domestic priority. And it is a big domestic priority, right? Upgrading the telecommunications infrastructure of the UK would be incredibly economically beneficial. And in that moment, the UK took a decision to deprioritize trading with the US, keeping China on board, and also, but mainly because of the domestic agenda. But then COVID happened, then Hong Kong happened, and then all of a sudden we saw a bit of a change in the UK's policy towards China again. Its hand was forced, and that reopened the opportunity of continuing discussions with the US. So my sort of point here is that I'm not sure how strategic it is versus how much it is just driven by other factors at any given time. And one of the strong factors on China at the moment is actually that there's quite a big hostility within the governing Conservative Party towards China. You can see lots of Conservative MPs writing papers about it, being very hostile. And whether that translates out to government policy, I'm not sure. But there are, so I don't know. The answer, that was a very long way of saying I don't know, but it's often it's often driven by things that adjacent to the China UK relationship.
I think you can be forgiven for not knowing, Sam, because they don't seem to know. I think that's part of the problem. Anu, if you were appointed to Boris Johnson's strategic trade advisor, how would you tell him to play the China game whilst triangulating with the EU, which, lest we forget, is still the place where a shrinking but well over 40% of our total exports go? How should he get the balance right, do you think?
So first of all, I hope that if there's a place where the UK can make a contribution, is that it try to also push for transatlantic alignment in a broader sense, that we have a broader coalition and that we focus on strengthening some of the existing institutions like the World Trade Organization. And that might be one way that we can try to come up with defending free trade, defending some of the common concerns we have, for instance, of distortion of trade because of the subsidization by Chinese governments of Chinese companies operating in the UK, in the EU, and in the United States as well. So there are certain places where I think the UK's interests, again, like I mentioned earlier, are aligned quite broadly with that of the US and the EU. But it's quite difficult because the EU has a hard time really settling on its China policy. There are lots of internal divisions within the EU because the member states are quite differentially exposed to China in terms of trade opportunities and the political alignment. So the EU has not had a common position on what to do with Huawei, for instance. The EU is having a very hard time now ratifying the new investment agreement with China. And the US tries to play a very active role in making sure that the UK and the EU would copy then the very aggressive stand that the US is taking. So there, I mean, all the talk about strategic autonomy and sovereignty of the EU probably shouldn't copy-paste what the US is doing. The UK should not copy-paste what the US is doing. But the challenge is big enough that I doubt any of these governments are better off trying to forge their own path towards countering China. But I think that's it's more of the UK is not alone in not having a very clear, effective strategy in how to deal with China.
It's difficult. Let's pull it back to what we're actually being asked to really talk about, which is EU-UK. The one place it seems to me that there is strategic coherence is this sovereignty agenda. It's the one thing that they seem to stick to. And there's a question here from Laura Stoimenova. I hope, Laura, I've not mangled your name there, which goes right back to the Ian Duncan Smith TIGA Task Force on Innovation, Growth and Regulatory Reform that I mentioned, that talked about this common law approach, this less precautionary principle approach, less sort of Code Napoleon dictatorial EU approach as the Brexiteers would characterize it. And, given the coherence of the sovereignty first agenda, we are kind of where we are, right? I don't think anyone should really think that this government, who may well be in power, if you look at British politics, for a good while yet, are going to easily slump back into regulatory alignment, right, in a slavish way. It's just not where they're going to go. So when you look at that agenda, Sam, where do you see, this is Lara's question, where do you see the main risks and where do you see the main opportunities? And do you think there are benefits to be won for the UK from deregulating to the extent advocating in this report? And my little add to that would be, and if so, where, for example?
So seeing the question, I just pulled up the report to just sort of see if I could synthesize the different recommendations. And I think one of the interesting things is I suppose they wouldn't frame it as deregulation, would they? Right, and I don't think they do for the most part. It's framed as regulating differently, and the sort of key areas they focus on are sort of well known. That financial services with a focus on fintech and venture finance. You've then got data.
There is a 2 out 1 in rule, isn't there? Recommendation in that report. So that is kind of.
Well, we've had that in UK. We've had that in the UK for years. That's not a new sort of recommendation. That's a lingering approach that's meant to have been there for a while. I mean, even in the EU, you've had that with the Better Regulation Initiative. So it's not something that's unique to the UK. And that some people think numbers of regulations matter more than anything else, which I find slightly bizarre. But in terms of
don't bear fruit, do they? I mean, the balance.
No, they never do. If you ask British people in public what they want to deregulate, they end up asking you to regulate more, and that's always the problem the deregulators have had. But if the question is, could the UK regulate differently in different spaces? Let's take data, for example, where the UK is having to walk quite an interesting tightrope in that it is more liberal than the EU average, I would suggest, when it comes to measures around the movement of data across borders, and also being fairly comfortable with personal data being stored outside of its own territory. And we can see this articulated through, say, the UK-Japan Free Trade Agreement, where it added provisions over and above the EU's trade agreement with Japan on digital services, making commitments not to force companies to store personal data within the territory of either country, also making quite strong commitments guarding against the imposition of duties on digital flows and in lots of other areas. But the UK is having to do this whilst retaining an adequacy decision from the EU, because its most important market remains the EU, and it doesn't want to hit a point whereby EU companies can't store the personal data of EU citizens can't be stored on data servers in the EU, in the UK, and processed there, because the UK has quite a lot of companies who do that, right? So the UK does have some opportunities here, and it is taking them to do things slightly differently, but it's still having to walk a bit of a tightrope, and it is still feeling that pull of the regulatory behemoth on its doorstep.
Yeah, so I know there's actually going to follow-up question here, which is related to that, I think, which is to what extent, this is from Adam Isaacs, who's a head of unit at European Parliament, to what extent is the Brussels effect diminished by the UK following its own path, and to what extent is close cooperation with the US essential to maintaining it into new areas like artificial intelligence? And the kind of flip side of that, I think, is to Sam's point about, well, you can diverge on data, but not too far, or you'll lose your EU equivalence. If the EU removed equivalence, it would come at a significant cost to the EU. So there's a kind of arbitrage. There's a kind of game of chicken here. So my kind of subset to that question is, to what extent do you anticipate the EU will use its regulatory heft to do what it was clearly intending to do throughout the trade negotiation, which is keep the UK close? Do you see this kind of constant tussle, and do you see Brussels, or do you think Brussels will say, well, off you go?
So I don't think the Brussels wants to send the message that off you go. And there certainly has been also the political need for the EU to defend the integrity of the single market, and to also send the message of what are the benefits of the membership, and make sure that we do not offer a membership and all the benefits without then the obligations that are embedded in that relationship. But when it comes then to the Brussels effect and whether it would be weak, and I've always argued that the Brexit will not weaken the Brussels effect to the extent that the Brussels effect actually undermines and compromises Brexit. There is no such thing as true regulatory sovereignty awaiting the UK anytime soon. So that's, I think, in one, we talked a lot about how that regulatory freedom is constrained by so many different pressures, whether it's the idea that the UK does feel the Brussels effect, whether it is the idea that any regulatory divergence would also drive a deeper wedge between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. And the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement itself, has all these clauses that continue to keep the UK rather close. But also to tie to the conversation we've had about the opportunities to trade internationally. The EU has had a tremendous regulatory influence, not just in the UK, but around the world. So when the UK sets out to negotiate a trade deal with another trade partner, most likely that trade partner already has a trade agreement with the EU and has been the recipient of the regulatory frameworks with the EU, and also doesn't want to be put in the position where they would need to be at fault of their commitments towards the EU. So in that sense, also the idea that the UK would have a blank slate to start thinking about how regulatory convergence works in the other markets that already have felt the impact of the EU regulation continues to sustain the Brussels effect. So the GDPR, that's a very good example. There are so many other countries that want to have the adequacy recognition from the EU or need to find a way to transfer data between their country and the EU. So that alone keeps them very close to the EU's regulatory framework. And this is the world that the UK needs to navigate.
It slightly begs the question, though, doesn't it? Which was, if we were obsessed by sovereignty on the UK side in the negotiation, the EU was obsessed with a level playing field and creating mechanisms to maintain the level playing field. So at some level, Brussels or the EU governments, particularly the French government, feared, at least nominally, that the UK was going to have a great advantage or success, even though from deregulation or from regulatory divergence, even though, as you say, it had this enormous lever, this tractor beam of the Brussels effect. So I mean, Sam, when we talk about macro, trying to make our neighborhood happier and healthier and our economies trading better, was that a mistake? I don't want to relitigate the Brexit negotiation, but actually, it seems to me, we collectively, the UK and the EU, have got ourselves in a sort of tangle here. Is there this is all kind of quite self-defeating, and I understand that the EU took a strategic decision. It was prepared to take the economic hit to preserve its own internal unity and all the rest of it. But now the deal is done, how do we get to a kind of better equilibrium than the one we're seeing at the moment, which frankly, the near-term horizon looks quite bleak, I think?
Well, I think first we do need to differentiate slightly between product standards and outcomes and production processes, insofar as much of the level playing field argument was around concerns that the UK would deregulate in a manner that made their companies more competitive. So this is the removal of environmental regulation or labour regulation that is costly. And the French were worried the UK would do that. It would drive down production costs in the UK, and that would lead to those companies being able to compete unfairly, in their view, on the EU market. Whereas when we're talking about, say, the Brussels effect and standards, we're often talking about the outcome, what processes those products or services need to clear and be signed off against in order to be placed upon your market. And that differentiation is important because, for the UK to sell into the EU, and UK companies sell into the EU, they will always need to meet EU standards, right? So that's a non-negotiable. Whereas the level playing field discussion was actually about the input into that production and the cost inputs of that and how that could impact on competition more broadly. So slightly different. But if your question is, were people maybe a bit too much concerned about divergence? I'd argue yes, insofar as much of that discussion ignored the political economy of the UK. The UK isn't a low regulation economy. And some of the reasons people think it is because we have lots of politicians who like to pretend we are and like to talk a lot about deregulation and about divergence and about sort of driving down labour costs. But I mean, the UK labour market is already very liberal. It's going to be difficult to liberalise it further. And on environment, the UK is actually quite stringent. And in the context of the EU, the UK often gold plates everything. To give examples of the UK still gold plates everything.
When it emerged that the previous business secretary was looking at ending the 48-hour week or changing the regulations,
I know.
there was enormous outcry, and they very quickly said, we're not doing anything of the kind, because as you say, the policies of that, nobody wants less paternity.
I think you called me up and I told you, I bet you it won't happen and it'll be reneged on in about a week. So yes. So I think some of that concern was misplaced. But then I also do think the UK is going to diverge in some areas. And I think a lot of that will be in fairly minor, and it will have to take into account what its relationship with the EU is. But there will just be some areas where they just go off in different directions. And maybe there'll be a really big reconvergence at some point in the future because the UK will realise it's having problems actually entering other markets, particularly the EU market. But there's going to be some. And I'm not so worried about it being deregulatory. I just think it might just be the result of different priorities. I'm hoping that most of the performative stuff dies down in the next few years. Although my view on this is always very long term because I feel I'm still fairly young, so I've got a lot of living left to do.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about the longer term, but you could argue that actually the longer it goes on, the longer the performative, and this I think would be a David Frost argument. You know, you often hear David Frost wants the relationship in the deep freeze. He wants the relationship. Wants the hard break because that's the only thing that, if you believe in the divergence agenda and the way that they negotiated Brexit, I mean, no one was sat in the pub in England saying, I'm not paying that common external tariff, I'm not signing up to that CE mark, right? You know, the politics of it was never really, it was very high politics that led to this very high divergence agenda. So do we think that
politics
over
changes.
time, but over time, in 10 or 15 years, as these things calcify and settle in, that actually the longer the performative divergence remains, actually the deeper the divergence will go, the bolder the UK will be in deregulating, because it knows it's never going to get any change out of the European Commission and the French government. And so then over time, we end up further away than perhaps we assume, maybe via the Brussels effect, we won't.
I mean, maybe everything's possible. I don't think the UK is going to rejoin the EU, for example. But I do think that there will be a deepening of the relationship on a formal basis in certain areas over the next 10, 15 years, just because people will forget some of this animosity and just start to make some practical considerations. And as you say, I'm not sure many British people are that incensed about European musicians being able to come over here on a fairly easy basis. So, I do think it will improve slightly, and I do think Frost is wrong when he says gravity doesn't matter.
Except on the musicians' front, right? If the people who've been disadvantaged by the musician thing is if you're the second violin in the Leeds Orchestra or the Manchester Orchestra, you got chance to cover for the second violin in the Paris Orchestra or the third or fourth violin. So you're lower down the food chain. If you're a great star, Sam Lowe virtuoso, someone will do the visa work for you, someone will. But what you're going to find is that the person who runs the Paris Orchestra, if you can have Peter or Pedro, but he can have Pedro at the drop of a hat and Peter after a load of hassle, he's going to have Pedro.
Yeah, and you're just describing supply chains.
The network is exactly the same. The networks will, calcify inside the single market, or will just solidify rather than calcify.
Yeah, of course, but I just think what we're talking about now is a moment in time with a very specific UK government that has just negotiated a trade agreement that saw it concede on nearly every point and claim victory, and is now having to mark its own homework. So it's never going to be a good moment right now. But we've got to assume that even if we have a Conservative government for the rest of my life, which is actually quite possible, that we're still going to see different shades of that Conservative government. The Conservative Party is very broad in terms of its objectives, and it changes very quickly. So my view would just be that, yes, whilst I just don't see things being as bad as it is right now forever, I'm not saying it's necessarily going to improve monumentally to the point that everyone's best friends again.
I think I agree with you, but I'm playing devil's advocate. Anu, how do you? What's your 5-10 year horizon?
No, at least if you look at the way the TCA was drafted, that certainly doesn't freeze the relationship. It allows for the relationship to evolve. It is quite flexible. The question is whether it will evolve in a way that is friendly or very acrimonial, how much it is drafted by litigation and the fights among the lawyers through various tariffs, and how much and sort of what is the spirit within which the agreement and the relationship will evolve. But certainly, every government has the option under the agreement to shift the relationship towards either a closer cooperation agreement whereby we do prioritize the economic interest and access to the single market, or then this unyielding notion of principal commitment to sovereignty. But I would like to think that at some point, this performative aspect has to also deliver concrete economic benefits for UK citizens, for you to maintain that. So you need to show that it is actually not just sovereignty that is valuable for the sake of that notion, but also because it leaves the UK and the UK citizens better off. And I think that is the mid to long-term challenge for the government, that it does need to translate it into concrete economic outcomes.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Sam, do you have a last word on that, on when common sense is going to, not common sense, but when, as you say, because there's always a lot of noise in the system, isn't there? You know, we've seen how political narrative trumps economics time and time again. You know, there's a lot of COVID noise in the current numbers. Do you think that kind of the real world requirements of industry will translate into closer relationships over time?
I think it will translate into some improvement. I'm not saying it's going to improve it for everyone. And you know, if I was to just look further into the future, I predict the UK reintegrates slightly on manufacturing and remains quite far apart on services and other areas where the UK probably does see greater opportunity for divergence and nimble thinking. But you know, I'm always optimistic, right? So I think you know this of me insofar as I thought there would be a withdrawal agreement. I thought there'd be a trade agreement. Had lots of people shout at me there was a trade agreement. And even on Northern Ireland Protocol issues, I'm fairly optimistic, at least on the practicalities. Even if you look at the last week, we've actually had a breakthrough, say, on medicines, for example, which is actually something that matters rather than sausages. So whilst the performative element just continues unabated, and it has throughout all of this, you know, I still think solutions are there, progress can be made, and I still just don't think there are much political cost to, in the future, some reconvergence in areas that the general public don't think about very much at all.
No, indeed, particularly once the government doesn't get benefit from rubbing that sore. Listen, it's been
on trade agreements, right? So in terms, so we haven't actually spoken about this, but just to finish, because actually what the UK does have as a visible trophy and a demonstrable benefit of exiting the EU as of now is the ability to announce trade agreements. So we've had Australia recently. We're going to get the New Zealand agreement in principle over the summer. We'll then get Australia announced again in October. Then we'll get New Zealand announced again. Then it will get implemented, and then we'll exceed the CPTPP, redo the Canada and Mexico negotiations, announce them as new free trade agreements, right? Well, despite them being rollovers. So there is this side of the agenda, and you can argue on the economics of it, but this is a demonstrable difference from what the EU could do, because the EU is not going to get a trade agreement with Australia anytime soon, because it's still
fundamentally quite performative. Anu, last word.
Fundamentally quite performative, yes, but it is something.
Anu?
You know, I want to share Sam's optimism, but also the kind of realism is that I have, as a researcher, needed to sort of question my commitment to rational choice theories and the idea that the economic outcomes are always driving the policy making. I've been spending much more time within the domain of political economy. So I agree that some of that will remain. But at the same time, I go back to saying this agreement, in many ways, Brexit is done, but this relationship and conversation will continue to evolve. My biggest hope is that that conversation will be based on facts. It will be based on the kind of commitment to try to look for outcomes where the lose-lose agreement in many ways can be converted to as good of an agreement and as close of a relationship that there can be between the two jurisdictions and nations, and that really do need each other for the challenges that we face.
I'm all in favour of fact-based conversations, which is what I hope we've been having for the last 55 minutes. It just remains to say thank you to Paul Adamson, actually, for making the EU UK Forum happen. It's a good and noble enterprise. Of course, to you, Anu, Professor Bradford, for your time, and to Sam also for your time and expertise. Thanks, everybody. I wish you a great rest of the programme.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone.